created by capitalist society. Capitalist society creates the possibility for unalienated, flourishing living. It's just that capitalist society then curtails the realization of those goods. So this is just to sort of introduce the distinctiveness of, I think, a non-humanist approach to social pathology, which is a radically historicist, though that's a word Althusser didn't like at all, approach to the problem of capital and the self, in which capitalism creates particular kinds of subjectivity, the subject of the proletariat, which can then free us all from social pathology. In that sense, then Lukács is very different from someone like Weber, for whom we're all in an iron cage. There's no one who's free of social pathologies. Lukács, who was Weber's kind of sort of student, and lots of Weber's great text, Economy and Society, is an implicit argument with Lukács and his Marxist students. Lukács is very keen on the idea that there are people who are able to escape from that social pathology, and that's the proletariat.
One of the aspects of Lukács that I really appreciated was he had one of the most, I think, direct perspectives on capitalist society being a social form that actively produces consciousness. So, for example, he writes, "Not until the rise of capitalism was a unified economic structure, and hence a formally unified structure of consciousness that embraced the whole society, brought into being." And I think a helpful and maybe cheeky metaphor to understand what Lukács thinks the capitalist mode of production is doing is a cup of tea, right? If you have a little white cup of steaming water and you drop in a black tea bag at the center, and at first there's this little kind of aura that forms around the bag, the color starts darkening, and that aura begins to expand and crawl outwards, and it infuses more and more of the water with its color. And before you know it, the entire cup of kind of once clear water is now this dark shade of brown emanating out from the tea bag at the center. And for Lukács, it's almost as if the capitalist mode of production is this tea bag dropped in the middle of society, the nature of which is to spread itself outwards and fuse more and more of its surrounding environment with its own substance or essence, right? To kind of restructure the molecular structure of the water or of the relationships of society and so on. And I think that while that might be a fun and admittedly abstract example, what Lukács writes about, and I'd really love to have you elaborate on this, is concretely, how is it that something like capitalism or the mode of production, the commodity form, spreads its own logic, right? What does it mean in less abstracted terms to talk about why it is that organizing a society in such a way where workers sell their time for a wage to capitalists who pursue profit, why does this have such the profound effect that Lukács documents that kind of winds up emanating outwards and kind of embracing all of society?
I think that's a great analogy. And the easy, quick answer to that question is that one of the centrally distinctive things about capitalist society, which again Marx and Engels had highlighted in the Communist Manifesto, is this expansionary norm. So, they say in the manifesto, previous ruling classes were conservative. They didn't like change. But the distinctive thing about the bourgeoisie as a ruling class is it needs change. It doesn't just want stability like a feudal ruling class does. It wants the feudal ruling class wants the peasants to stay on the land and do as they're told. The bourgeoisie needs constant innovation in order to stay in business by outcompeting its rivals. Now, it's worth noting, actually, that there's a tradition of anti-capitalism which is quite critical of Marx on this point and thinks that Marx perhaps took to heart too much bourgeois claims about the bourgeoisie, in which it's endlessly innovative and progressive and productive. So people like Fernand Braudel and Giovanni Arrighi have highlighted the idea that actually most capitalists are quite happy with a steady rate of profit and are not constantly needing to expand their business all the time, partly because they can succeed in generating monopolistic conditions where they're not always facing competition. And Marx wasn't at all unaware of that. But the basic idea of that expanding norm means that whereas in feudal society, and I'm constantly using here as a kind of foil, a very simplistic image of, my brother's a medieval historian who would be furious with me for my images of feudal Europe as this kind of, but I'm just using it as a rhetorical foil to highlight the specificities of capitalist society. And, in that feudal society, in my butchered image of it, boulderized image of it, I might go, if I want to listen to a piece of music, I might go round to my friend's dwelling and sit and listen to my friend play the guitar for me or whatever it is. Whereas in a capitalist society, I'll go on the internet now and I'll buy a track online, or in the old days, I'll go to a record shop and buy a record. So more and more of life comes to be dominated by the economy. That is to say, this experience that previously was outside anything you might call the economy, not that they have the term in medieval Europe, like listening to a piece of music, that's just part of my social and cultural life that I do with my friends. That then becomes part of the economy. I'm using money and I'm doing it. And that realm, the economy, expands in a capitalist society because capitalists must expand and must dominate dominate more and more in order to continue to accumulate profits, and not if they stand still to be driven out of business by their rivals. So that's the kind of first order answer, I hope quite simple answer about why capitalism is an expansionary norm and not just a stable one. But you also raise a very important point about this idea. Lukács says the distinctiveness of Marxism is not that it gives you the explanation from the economic point of view. Marxism is usually today talked about as an economic determinism. Lukács says, no, the distinctiveness of Marxism is that it has the point of view of totality. And here he means to say you can understand a whole social world, a social totality, as this thing that he calls the commodity structure. So as you can fold it out, as you were saying, from the logic of the commodity. And that is very different from his mentor and sparring partner, Weber, for whom capitalism is just a form of rationalization, and bureaucracy is another form of rationalization. So Lukács wants to see not these kind of multiple strands, and capitalism is just one, but instead a totality organized around what Althusser would actually consider a pretty simplistic picture of totality, organized around a single essence underpinning all of these complex, messy appearances. And that single essence is the commodity and its measurement by this abstraction value. So the search for rational ordering principles in the world that you see in someone like Darwin, trying to organize history according to certain clear sets of rational ordering principles, that might reflect, for Lukács, I think, does reflect what it is to live in a consumer society, a commodity society, in which everything must be measured and quantified, and every moment of time must be, E.P. Thompson has a famous essay about the factory clock, every moment of time must be regulated and monitored in order to extract value from it. This kind of quantification measurement system affects then how we come to think about science. The individual subject becomes our starting point for thinking about the whole world. We talked at the beginning of our conversation about the poverty of that view of the world. Well, thinking the individual subject as our starting point is for Lukács a very bourgeois way of thinking about the world, because what it is to live in a bourgeois society is not to engage with the world as king or peasant, but as abstract owner of my labor power if I'm a worker, or of capital if I'm a capitalist, who must then go out and war with others in the world for a job or for profits. That subject, the individual subject, is then imagined relating to the external world through a very, very particular logic, which is possession. So I mentioned earlier, Kant describes the marriage as a contract for ownership over the conjugal faculties of another. So Lukács gives you this amazing, the reason the essay is so extraordinary, I think, to read is he folds out, whether it's modern science or literature or philosophy in the form of Immanuel Kant, he folds out so much of the ways that we have of thinking about the world as the consequence of living in a commodity structure. One thing I think it's important